How are we doing, Jets fans? I'm Glenn Naughton with JetNation.com. Be sure to log into JetNation.com where you can register and become a part of what is the most active Jets message board on the web. We are joined today by a special guest, Scott Carter, who covers the Florida Gators for Gators.com. And Scott's been on the show. He's been kind enough to join us a few times in the past when the Jets have taken some Florida prospects. And I got to be honest, I was watching some Florida games a few weeks ago to look at the guys who were out there, and I thought this team's got a lot of guys who are going to be drafted this year. Let's reach out to Scott, see if he wants to come on and talk about some of them. And we do appreciate your time as always, Scott. How are we doing?
Hey, Glenn, doing well, man. Glad to be here. And yeah, Florida, it was coming off a 6-7 season. Not what a lot of people nationally probably expect out of the Florida Gators. But as always, they do have some draftable players. As you mentioned, the pro day down here last month. It was the biggest pro day since Tim Tebow's pro day back in 2010. So that kind of tells you who was the star attraction. But a lot of other guys got looks as well. So that, we'll see how it shakes out. I'm kind of curious. I'm ready for the draft. I'm over kind of all the projections and the hot takes. I just want to see who goes where, man.
Yeah. We all get there at some point in the off season. The draft is such a hot topic, but it especially when you're the Jets at least were in the playoff hunt this year, but when you're bad and you're looking for the draft by week 5, and you've got 12 weeks of and then playoffs, you're looking at like a 7-8 month process. But like I said, at least the Jets were a little competitive this year. So let's start off at the top, right? The top guy, the name everybody's talking about, and rightfully so, quarterback Anthony Richardson. Now the Jets, of course, won't be, well, at least I don't believe we'll be looking at a quarterback at 12 or 13. Some people seem to think differently. My biggest thing on Richardson, I find myself saying the same exact things I said about Josh Allen when he came out, which was, yes, there are some questions, but my goodness, you just look at the athletic ability. And I could not. A lot of people gave Buffalo a hard time for taking Josh Allen. I couldn't. I said, look, I get the jokes. I get that he's wild. He's a little erratic. But when you look at that skill set, I cannot knock a team for saying if we can get that guy right, we can be elite in a hurry.
Yeah, and I think that's where the talk is around Anthony Richardson. Obviously, he's one of those prospects that you look at his stats in college, and nothing's going to blow you away, Glenn. And he was, quite frankly, very inconsistent at times. I mean, he was probably at his best when he was just playing free out there and not held back. But yet, coaches don't like that too often when a guy's not running their system and playing discipline. And I think that's where Anthony had some trouble. So the NFL, wherever he goes, they're getting a player that without question has some of a skill set that you just don't see very often in a quarterback. And I mean, the comparison that everybody's thrown out there, obviously, is Cam Newton. And we know what Cam Newton did. He was a pretty good NFL quarterback for a long time. I mean, Anthony's got an unbelievable arm, can throw the ball 75, 80 yards in the air in a perfect tight spiral. He's a great athlete. A lot of fans out there may have seen, I think in his first real action at Florida, him leaping a player that went viral. He can, make plays with his legs, make plays with his arms. He's 6'4", 240 pounds, and he runs. I think it was something like the fastest 40 for a quarterback at the combine, his size in 23 years. So let's face it, man, the guy has all the tools. Now, can he develop into the kind of player that the NFL is kind of hot with right now with these quarterbacks like Patrick Mahomes and so many others? So he's one of the most intriguing players in the draft, Glenn. And I mentioned earlier just how the pro day here at Florida. I mean, he drew a lot of attention. Every team was here. The Bills head coach, the Panthers head coach. So I think he's good. I think he's safely in the top 10 at this point. But it's a great quarterback class at top. I mean, Bryce Young, C.J. Stroud, Will Levis getting a lot of love. Hendon Hooker, a guy who I saw play this year in a great game when they beat the Gators up in Knoxville. I mean, he's getting some late love here. So I'm like everybody else out there. I want to see where AR goes.
Yeah, I think you talk about the 40 and the arm and all these things. It's to me, it's not even that he does all these things at an elite level. Like he might, when you put the whole package together, he might do all these things better than anyone we've ever seen. Now, of course, this isn't playing the game on Sundays. I understand that, but just the tools that are at his disposal. are just he's going to be a fun one to watch. He really is.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to see the reaction here in Gainesville and really Florida fans. Gator fans obviously are very familiar with Anthony. He came in at the end of 2019, and they were excited that he was going to be the next great one. And then he had to wait his turn, and he finally gets his turn. And let's face it, I mean, he was inconsistent this year. Made some eye-popping plays, and you're like, oh man, if he could do that consistently, this guy is going to be unbelievable. But then he would throw an interception here and there. You're like, whoa, what's going on there? But having erased all that, NFL doesn't care any about that, right? They care about how he's projected as a potential NFL quarterback and who's what. I mean, I can understand why all the buzz about Anthony in the draft. I mean, to me, I've said this, Glenn, I've written it. He's going to be one of those picks by whichever team takes him. That general manager and coach, they're going to be all in on Anthony, and they're either going to look like geniuses or they're going to get fired in 2 or 3 years. I mean, that's just the kind of pick he. But it's a kind of pick that if I'm a GM in NFL and he's on the board when I'm picking, I'm having a hard time not selecting him.
That's exactly that. So another guy that teams are we anticipate are going to have a hard time not selecting. Although I always say we never know with the mocks and these. Everyone we hear publicly who's falling, who's rising. Really, we don't know. We're not looking at anyone's draft boards. We don't know who's falling in reality. We know the perception, we know the rumors, things like that. But Osiris Torrance, the right guard, got a lot of love early on. It's like this guy's a lock to go first, in the first round. I loved his game. I said at one point after watching a few of his games, I thought he might be the safest prospect I watched. Like you didn't see like the floor. He looked to have a really high floor, ceiling through the roof, really high floor. Doesn't really have any bad tape. He had a few reps against Jalen Carter where Carter gets the best of him, but it's Jalen Carter. When you face off two elite players, two guys who are going, are good enough to go in round one. Some guys you're going to win some and you're going to lose some. But on the whole, I mean, Osiris Torrance looks like he's got the ability to be a really high level starter in the NFL. Some people have said maybe he gets a look at tackle. I don't know about that. But what can you tell us about Osiris Torrance from what you've seen on a regular basis out of him?
Osiris really was one of the more interesting players on the roster this past season because we really didn't know much about him when he came in. He was with Napier at Louisiana, and then he transfers over to Florida for 1 year when Napier got the Florida job. So right away, he was plugged into the starting lineup. So, okay, I mean, you got to kind of, at that point, as an observer, Napier has this kind of confidence. Let's see what kind of a player he is because there was all these questions about, well, at Louisiana, he's not in the SEC, so it's going to be a tougher go for him when the conference play starts. But Torrance really held his own throughout. And by mid-season, a lot of the projections, like you just mentioned, suddenly he's a potential first-round pick. He's grading off the chart every week during games. And just a guy that, to talk about his impact, I mean, last couple weeks ago, there was a ceremony here on campus. They have a walkway outside the football facility where if you're a first-team All-American, by the major publications, you get your own brick out there. And the Gators hadn't laid one since Kyle Pitts back in 2020, the tight end. So Osiris got one of those bricks. So that kind of tells you what he did at Florida. He's a big, thick guy, holds his spot on the ground. You look at him and you're not going to be blown away by the body athleticism or anything, but he's just one of those inside guys. I think his future is definitely at guard in the league. But he's big enough and can move his feet well enough to maybe get a fill-in spot on the outside once in a while. But I think long-term he's an interior lineman. And he's a guy that, as you mentioned, potential late first-round guy, early second round, but a guy that really made the most of his opportunity in his one season at Florida.
Yeah, I think later in the season, I should say, when the Jets were sitting in the 20s, I think there were a few folks, myself included, who kind of thought, you know what, if the Jets are at 24, 23, when it looked like they might make the playoffs, so much for that. You kind of thought this could be the guy. He might be the pick. Obviously not the case now with where they are at 13. But another guy on that, in the trenches, Florida had some really good names, some really productive players. Jervon Dexter, the defensive tackle, really athletic, really good motor. What are your thoughts on him from what you've seen?
Well, Jervon's, he's the classic to me. His best football is still ahead of him. I never thought that he produced like I expected with the Gators, but in fairness to him, because if you look at him, he's definitely an NFL type body, and that's what the NFL personnel seeing. And his stock has really kind of jumped a little bit in the last couple of months as he prepares for the draft. But he was getting double teamed a lot at Florida, so they knew that opposing teams knew that he was going to be the guy up front that could really disrupt things. So they paid extra attention to him, and I think that's partly responsible for maybe his stats not being as good as we thought when he signed with the Gators. But this was a guy that a 5-star player coming out of high school. He was one of the top recruits under the Dan Mullen, the previous coach, and he was a leader up there on the defensive line. I think he's got some good burst, just a big body built for the interior defensive line. I think, like I said, I think I can understand why NFL teams are very intrigued by Gervon because, again, like I said, I think he's got a. We've only seen a little bit of his potential yet. If he develops like I think he can.
Now, one guy who I was watching fairly closely last year, I thought he might come out. Turns out he didn't. Trey Dean at safety, and you've also got Rashad Torrance, so you can cover both safeties if you like. But one thing about Dean that worried me a little bit pre-combine, pre-pro day, all that stuff. I didn't know if he had pro speed. You don't know what these guys are going to run. Dean came in at 4.75, which was even a little bit slower than I expected. But you do see some moments on when you watch him on game day. He does have some ball skills. You do see him getting in there, some PBUs. Had himself a nice week at the Senior Bowl. Game-ending interception, if I recall correctly. But sort of Dean and Torrance, you look at a lot of the draft, the pundits and the sites, they're not graded all that far apart. They're sort of clustered in together. What are your thoughts on those two, on Trey Dean and Rashad Torrance? Because as I said, there's a need at safety for the Jets, but the consensus seems to be this isn't the strongest class outside of Brian Branch. So who knows, who goes where.
Yeah. Well, I know Jets fans are familiar with a couple of Florida DBs in recent years. You had Brian Poole, you had Marcus May, and I thought those guys were certainly better college players than either Torrance or Dean. I don't know. I look at Torrance and Dean both maybe as developmental guys in the NFL, special teams guys early on. Trey Dean came in as a high recruit out of South Georgia, and he played a lot right from the start, Glenn. But he kind of developed into a love-hate relationship with Gator fans. He'd have a good game, and then he'd be exposed some, and he did hold his own in the postseason All-Star game that you mentioned, winning the MVP. I think he's probably a little more upside than Rashad Torrance long term. But I'll be surprised if either one of those guys are able to make an impact early, with an NFL team. I think, as I said, they're both developmental guys, maybe special teams, and then we'll see if they can get in a spot that really fits them and climb up the ladder, so to speak.
All right, and let's talk about Brenton Cox a little bit. The edge rusher came into the year high expectations. I can't remember which games I'd watched. There were a couple games early on. Having watched him last year, watched a couple of his games this year, and then turned on another Florida game and heard them say he was dismissed from the team, which I didn't even realize at that point. So I kind of took him off the list of players to watch that day. And but still a really talented guy. Didn't sound like it was anything huge that got him dismissed. But it being his second team, Georgia dismissed him as well. So, will this hurt his draft stock? We'll see. But still, another really talented guy, really disruptive, plays with his hair on fire. Sometimes a little too aggressive. Sometimes you worry about, is he going to be that guy that gets you that late hit in a big spot? But, the talent is there without a doubt.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it really on the head with Brenton in a lot of ways, Glenn. I think what really cost him at Florida in a lot of ways was he flew solo a lot when during a play he would just kind of take off and maybe not feel his assignment. That frustrated coaches. Without question, he's got a lot of talent. Again, a 5-star recruit who signed with Kirby Smart in Georgia. Started some up there, but then after a year he transferred to Florida and instantly became really one of those players on Florida's roster. All you had to do look at him and that this guy's got the NFL body, probably going to play in the league in some capacity. And I mean, his signature game at Florida was the 2021 game against Florida State when he tied the school record with 4 sacks. So a lot was expected out of him in 2022. But he was inconsistent. There were some issues behind the scenes with just being disciplined with what the coaches were asking. And I think Billy Napier, who, he comes in and is trying to create a new culture, kind of create more accountability. I think Brian Cox just, kind of wore out his welcome there late in the season, and Billy dismissed him. But they did invite him back for pro day so he could get a look in front of the scouts. And I didn't think he particularly had a great pro day. And he didn't talk to the media afterwards, so I don't know what he thought about it. But I do think he's a guy that is sort of a mystery. There's probably going to be someone who's certainly going to draft him late or sign him to the practice squad. And they may get a player who snuck under the radar because of some past issues. And he could turn out to be a good player. I think there's a lot of potential there. I just think right now he's some teams will like him a lot more than others. You know how that works. But it only takes one, and I would expect him to find a home in the league.
One thing we're hearing from a lot of pundits, and it's true. If you look up and down the mock draft boards or even just the draft prospects, a lot of the top guys in this class at receiver are a lot of undersized guys. Not a lot of big receivers in this class. Of course, you got Justin Shorter coming out of Florida, 6'3", good size, strong guy, inconsistent production, as is the case with so many college guys. How much of that is down to the fact that, as we've mentioned, his quarterback, while some elite traits, was inconsistent. But Shorter, not afraid to get physical. Love what he brings as a blocker. I've see him take guys out on screens and lay out safeties and corners. So he brings more than just being a big-bodied receiver. He can be a factor in other ways. Again, there seem to be some concerns about his production, just over sort of 400 or 500 yards each of the last two seasons. What are your thoughts on him?
I like Justin a lot as a player. Like you said, you mentioned his size. He's got kind of deceptive speed. He had a couple of nice long touchdown catches from Anthony Richardson this season. He's another guy that was a 5-star player coming out of high school. So impressed a lot of recruiters, signed with Penn State. And, in this new age of college football, these guys move around a lot. So he ended up at Florida, one of their big additions under Dan Mullen. And his production was a little bit better under Dan Mullen because, Mullins throws the ball a little bit more. It took a little step back for some of the reasons you mentioned with inconsistency in the passing game, a first-year coach, really an offense built more around the running game. But Justin Shorter is able to block on the edges. He's a guy that I know he was well-liked in the locker room. Coaches were always kind of high on him. And I think he's a player that it all depends on really what kind of system you run, what kind of a quarterback you have. He can find a spot. I mean, he's more like you mentioned. He's kind of one of those old school receivers in NFL, one of those bigger guys who you used to see more than you see now. But if the trend or one team decides to go big receiver, needs a big receiver, I can see Justin being a good pick for him.
All right, back to the trenches on the O line. Late round guy, maybe UDFA range. Richard Gorridge. He's a guy who, from what I've seen, the games I've taken the time to watch, looks like he's a lot farther along as a pass protector than a run blocker, but still a big guy who, he's likely to get a look somewhere. Is he a draftable prospect from what you're hearing, or is he looking at sort of late day three or undrafted free agent area status?
My guess is late day three, undrafted free agent, but I do think he will land somewhere to get an opportunity. And you hit it again on the head. You watched the tape. He is a better pass blocker at this point in his career because, his first really 4 seasons was under Mullen, more of a pass-oriented offense. This year with Napier, more of a run scheme. And I think at times he had to adjust some things to his game and maybe didn't have his best season. But Richards got the big body, got the work ethic, just a guy that I think you want to at least give a chance to if you're in the league, because I think he can really add a depth piece there to your roster down the road and maybe develop into a starter. And, of course, the way the NFL is now with the wide open offenses, the passing game kind of really dominating the league in a lot of ways. I mean, he can be a nice pass protector for you. So I think that should help his case, in the draft or at least in the free agent market.
All right, last but not least, I waited till last for specifically for Ventrell Miller, linebacker. He is a Florida Gator who the Jets had in for a visit. So there may be some interest there. We know the visits aren't always what they appear, but there is a need there for the Jets. They will look to add a linebacker at some point. At least that's the school of thought. Miller, to me, great anticipation. Like, I can't say I know the guy watches a ton of film, but I watch him and I think this guy must watch a ton of film. You see him anticipate really well, breaking on the ball, breaking on receivers, before the ball's out of their quarterback's hand. Like, he knows where it's going. So whether it's a combination of great instincts and film study, I can't say for sure, but the guy knows what he's doing out there. Very aware player. In coverage, maybe not a high end coverage guy, but in all reality, in today's game, how many linebackers can say they can do all of that stuff at a very high level? But Miller, like I said, it's a need for the Jets. He's a guy they've had in. What are your thoughts on Ventrell?
Yeah, Ventrell is one of my favorites to come through in a while. He's one of these guys. He was a 6-year guy because of an injury in 2021. Missed most of the year. Came back last year and had a really good season. Ventrell, he is a very instinctive player. That's something that you don't teach that so much. But he improved as a player by watching a lot of film. He's kind of a student of his craft, takes it seriously, developed into a team leader, and maybe undersized a tad in the NFL, but I think he always had great closing speed to me. And that's in part because of just being a little bit of instinctive ahead of the game in terms of anticipation. And I would think that he would be a late draft pick. I don't know where he's going to go, but I know there's going to be some interest in him, certainly on the free agent market if he doesn't get drafted, because he has some of those intangibles, Glenn, that we talk about that, he you just can't teach. And he grew a lot as a person at Florida. He came in from a good high school program down in Lakeland, came up here, and it took him a while, I think, to find his spot. Had some issues off the field his first year, just kind of a teenager doing stupid stuff. But then, he grew up, and by the end of it, he was really one of the team leaders and one of the guys that Billy Napier felt comfortable enough in his first year at Florida to let kind of have that strong voice in the locker room. And so Ventrell, he'll be interesting to see because I do think he offers a lot of those things that you just doesn't show up necessarily on the I don't know, the film or the scouting report, but he's got something there that makes him a good player.
All right, Scott Carter, Florida Gators. Thanks so much for joining us, giving us some time to go over some of these players. And I'll tell you, there's a couple guys next year. I think we'll be talking again. There's some really good players on that, some young up and coming players on that Gators team.
Yeah, they revamped their roster, Glenn. I mean, it's going to be a totally different Florida program than even from a year ago. They've got 35 new players. So,
wow.
So we'll see. But yeah, I do think they have some NFL talent, certainly. And we'll see if it results in a better season. I know Billy Napier is hoping so.
All right. Thanks again, Scott. We really appreciate your time.
All right, Glenn. Thank you, bud.
Thank you.
All right, man. Cool. All right, Glenn.